At approximately 10:15 on the night of April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth shot President Abraham Lincoln inside Ford's Theater. Minutes later, Booth disappeared into the streets of Washington. The Capitol was filled with soldiers. Bridges could be closed. Telegraph messages could travel faster than any horse, and yet the most wanted man in America remained free for 12 days. He crossed more than 90 miles through Washington, Maryland, and Virginia, while thousands of soldiers, detectives, and civilians searched for him. So how did Booth escape the nation's capital? Who helped him stay hidden? And what mistake finally brought the manhunt to a burning tobacco barn? After firing a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head, Booth dropped his small pistol and moved toward the front of the presidential box. He climbed over the railing and jumped toward the stage below. During the fall, he injured his left leg. Historians still debate whether the bone broke during this jump or later, when his horse fell during the escape. But Booth did not stop. He crossed the stage, ran through a rear passage, and escaped through a door leading into Baptist Alley. A young theater worker was holding Booth's rented horse behind the building. Booth mounted and rode into the darkness. Washington had not yet fully understood what had happened. News of the shooting was spreading, but the city's exits had not all been sealed. One Booth rode toward the Navy Yard Bridge, one of the main routes leading from Washington into Maryland. The bridge was supposed to be closed to civilian traffic at night, but the guard had not yet received news of the assassination. Booth persuaded him to allow passage. The first barrier in the largest manhunt in American history had failed before the hunt had even begun. But Booth was not escaping alone. Somewhere ahead of him, another conspirator was also riding toward Maryland. That conspirator was David HEROLD. Earlier that evening, HEROLD had guided Lewis Powell to the home of Secretary of State William Seward, where Powell carried out a violent but unsuccessful assassination attempt. HEROLD then fled and eventually joined Booth in Maryland. Together, they rode to the Surratt Tavern in Surrattsville, now Clinton, Maryland. Weapons, field glasses, and other supplies had previously been hidden there as part of Booth's earlier plan to kidnap Lincoln. The tavern keeper, John Lloyd, later said Booth openly announced that he had killed the president. That statement reveals something important about Booth's state of mind. He was not yet acting like a man ashamed of his crime. He believed he had performed a heroic act for the defeated Confederacy. But his injured leg was becoming a serious problem. A fugitive on horseback could move quickly. A fugitive with a broken bone needed a doctor. And seeking medical help would create the first major link in the trail behind him. During the early hours of April 15th, Booth and HEROLD arrived at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd examined Booth's leg and placed it in a splint. Booth was using an assumed identity, but Mudd had met him before during the abandoned kidnapping plot against Lincoln. Exactly how much Mudd understood that morning became one of the most controversial questions connected to the assassination. Later, Mudd traveled into town and heard that Lincoln had been shot. When he returned, Booth and HEROLD were forced to leave. The fugitives headed toward the home of Samuel Cox, a Confederate sympathizer. But they became lost in Zakiah Swamp. For two men trying to outrun the federal government, the landscape itself had become an enemy. They eventually found Oswald Swan, a free black man, and paid him to guide them toward Cox's home. The irony was striking. A man who killed Lincoln in support of the Confederate cause now depended on a black guide to continue his escape. But even after reaching Cox, Booth could not simply continue south. The roads were becoming more dangerous. The search was expanding, and his next hiding place would become both his greatest protection and his psychological prison. Samuel Cox directed Booth and HEROLD to a pine thicket near Belle Alton, Maryland. There, they met Thomas Jones, a former Confederate agent, who agreed to help them cross the Potomac River into Virginia. For 4 nights, Booth and HEROLD remained hidden in the woods. Jones brought them food, information, and newspapers. The newspapers allowed Booth to see how the country was reacting to Lincoln's assassination. He had imagined that many people would celebrate him as a new Brutus, a man who had killed a tyrant for the sake of liberty. Instead, the newspapers described him as a murderer. The Confederacy was collapsing. Lincoln was being mourned across the North, and Booth's own act was widely condemned. While hiding, Booth wrote bitterly in his diary. He defended the assassination and complained that he was being hunted and treated as a common criminal. This was the psychological turning point of the escape. Booth was no longer only running from soldiers. He was confronting the collapse of the heroic identity he had created for himself. But the government still did not know exactly where he was. Thomas Jones waited until the search shifted away from the immediate area. Then, on the night of April 20th, he led Booth and Herold toward a small boat on the Potomac. Virginia appeared to be only one river crossing away, but the river had other plans. The night was foggy. Jones gave Booth a compass, a candle, and an oar. Herold also received an oar, and the two men pushed away from the Maryland shore in a small fishing boat. Their objective was simple: cross the Potomac and reach Virginia, where they expected to find more support among former Confederates. Instead, they lost their direction in the darkness. When morning came, Booth and Herold discovered that they were still in Maryland, approximately 9 miles upriver from where they had begun. After days of hiding and planning, they had spent the entire night rowing, only to remain on the wrong side of the river. The failed crossing cost them another day. They rested at a farm connected to one of Herold's acquaintances, then tried again the following night. This time, they successfully reached Virginia. Booth believed the most dangerous part of the escape was behind him. In reality, crossing into Virginia removed him from the network that had protected him in Maryland. From this point forward, he would increasingly depend on strangers, and strangers were harder to control. After landing in Virginia, Booth and Herold searched for Confederate sympathizers who might provide food, horses, and shelter. But the reception was not what Booth expected. Some people gave them food, but refused to become deeply involved. Dr. Richard Stewart offered limited assistance and wanted the fugitives removed from his property. Booth became angry and increasingly desperate. At the cabin of William Lucas, a free black man, Booth threatened Lucas with a knife and forced the family from its home so the fugitives could sleep there. The escape was revealing Booth's character more clearly. He had imagined himself as a political hero, but his survival now depended on threats, deception, and the exploitation of people with less power than himself. On April 24th, Booth and Herold reached the Rappahannock River at Port Conway. There, they met 3 former Confederate soldiers: Mortimer Ruggles, Absalom Bainbridge, and Willie Jett. Herold revealed Booth's true identity to Jett. It was a reckless decision. Until that moment, many of the people they encountered knew only that they were helping suspicious travelers or former Confederate soldiers. Now a new person knew exactly who Booth was. Jett helped find a place for him at Richard Garrett's farm near Port Royal. Booth introduced himself under the false name John W. Boyd and claimed to be a wounded Confederate soldier returning home. For one night, the disguise worked, but then suspicion began to grow. On April 25th, Booth ate breakfast and spent time with the Garrett children. For a few hours, the farm seemed like a place where he might rest and plan his next move. Then reports arrived that Union cavalry was approaching. Booth fled into nearby woods. His sudden behavior alarmed the Garrett family. Jack Garrett, who had served in the Confederate Army, began to suspect that Booth and Herold might be criminals or horse thieves. That night, the family refused to let the 2 men sleep inside the farmhouse. Instead, Booth and Herold were placed in a tobacco barn. The Garretts locked the barn, partly because they feared the strangers might steal their horses. Meanwhile, the federal search was finally closing in. Union soldiers had located Willie Jett in Bowling Green. Under questioning, Jett agreed to take them to the Garrett farm. The escape had not collapsed because soldiers followed Booth's footprints across 90 miles. It collapsed because Booth's network had become too large. Every new helper became another possible witness, and Willie Jett became the human link that led the cavalry directly to the barn. At approximately 2 o'clock on the morning of April 26th, Detectives and soldiers from the 16th New York Cavalry reached Garrett Farm. They surrounded the tobacco barn and ordered the fugitives to surrender. David HEROLD gave himself up. Booth refused. He asked the soldiers to move back and allow him to fight his way out. They rejected the request. Detective Everton Conger then ordered the barn set on fire, hoping the flames would force Booth outside. As the fire spread, Booth moved through the smoke with weapons in his hands. Sergeant Boston Corbett watched through an opening in the barn. Although the soldiers had been ordered to capture Booth alive, Corbett believed Booth was preparing to fire. He shot through the wall. The bullet struck Booth in the neck, damaged his spinal cord, and left him paralyzed. Soldiers dragged him from the burning barn and placed him on the porch of the Garrett farmhouse. Booth could barely speak. According to accounts preserved by the National Park Service, he asked that his hands be raised so he could see them. Looking at them, he reportedly whispered, "Useless. Useless." At around 7:15 that morning, John Wilkes Booth died. He was 26 years old. The 12-day manhunt was over, but the investigation into the conspiracy had only begun. Booth did not remain free for 12 days because he had defeated the entire federal government through intelligence alone. He survived because several advantages temporarily worked in his favor. Washington reacted with confusion during the first minutes after the shooting. The Navy Yard Bridge had not yet received the warning. Booth had prepared horses, weapons, and supplies. He knew sympathizers and former Confederate agents across southern Maryland, and the countryside offered forests, swamps, rivers, and isolated farms where two men could disappear. But those advantages gradually became weaknesses. His injured leg slowed him down. Every doctor, guide, agent, farmer, and former soldier who helped him became another link investigators could discover. The defeat of the Confederacy reduced the number of people willing to risk their lives for him, and Booth's own need for recognition led him to reveal his identity. His escape ended not because of one dramatic mistake, but because secrecy became harder to maintain with every mile. Subscribe for a new historical investigation each week. Stories about the decisions, mistakes, and hidden connections behind history's greatest turning points. In the next episode, we examine the people Booth left behind. Who helped plan the attack? Who tried to kill Secretary of State William Seward? And why 4 conspirators were ultimately executed? Booth was dead. But the question of how far the conspiracy reached was only beginning.